In 2011, Canva did not exist. Figma did not exist. The idea of a £10 a month design tool that anyone with a laptop could use did not exist either. What existed was Adobe, a company so dominant in creative software that its name had become a verb. You did not edit a photo, you photoshopped it. In 2013, Adobe announced something that sent its share price tumbling, triggered a petition signed by 50,000 people, and made the design community absolutely furious. It announced that you could no longer buy its software, not outright, not ever again. If you wanted Photoshop, you would now rent it, every single month, for as long as you needed it. On the surface, it looked like corporate greed, a company strong-arming its customers into an endless payment cycle, and that is how much of the press framed it at the time. But that framing misses something far more interesting. What Adobe actually did in 2013 was not just a pricing change. It was a controlled demolition of its own business model, executed deliberately before the market could do it for them. This is the story of how Adobe killed its own business, and why that decision turned a £4 billion company into a £21 billion one. Part 2. The box on the shelf. To understand why Adobe blew up its own model, you first need to understand what that model was, and why it looks so solid from the outside. For most of its history, Adobe sold software the same way a high street shop sells a television. You paid once, you got a disc, you installed it, and it was yours. Adobe Creative Suite, the bundle that included Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Premiere Pro, and several others, retailed for well over £1,000, closer to $2,500 for the full production bundle in the United States. That's a significant upfront cost. But for professional designers, filmmakers, and agencies, it wasn't unreasonable. These tools were industry standard. There was no real competition, and once you owned a version, it worked. You didn't need to upgrade every cycle. Many studios ran CS4 or CS5 for years without touching a newer release, and that right there is the first crack in the model, because Adobe's revenue was almost entirely dependent on upgrade cycles. Every 2 to 3 years, the company would ship a new version of Creative Suite, and it would generate a significant revenue spike. But between those releases, relative silence. New customers were buying in, but existing customers had little reason to spend again unless the new version offered something genuinely compelling. This created a financial pattern that every Adobe chief financial officer understood intimately. Revenue wasn't smooth, it was lumpy. And lumpy revenue is the kind that makes investors nervous, because it's hard to predict and easy to miss. Part 3. The piracy problem. But the upgrade cycle problem was manageable. What wasn't manageable, or at least what wasn't being managed, was what was happening on torrent sites. Before Creative Cloud, Adobe software dominated piracy charts. Photoshop alone was consistently one of the most torrented pieces of software on earth. At its peak, Adobe products occupied 10 of the top 20 most pirated applications on the Pirate Bay. 10, half the list. Now, there are two ways to interpret that statistic. The first is the obvious one. These are lost sales. Millions of people were using software they did not pay for, money Adobe will never see. The second interpretation is less obvious but arguably more important. It means Adobe had already won the market. These were not people choosing a competitor, they were choosing Adobe, they just were not paying for it. The piracy problem was not really a piracy problem, it was a pricing problem. The product was desirable. The barrier was the price tag. If you could lower that barrier dramatically, you might convert a significant proportion of those users into paying subscribers. Not all of them, but enough. This is the logic Adobe's leadership was working through around 2011. And it is the kind of logic that sounds obvious in retrospect, but it requires genuine nerve to act on, because acting on it means dismantling a revenue model that was, by most measures, still working. Part 4. The controlled demolition. Adobe introduced Creative Cloud in 2011 not as a replacement but as an alternative. You could still buy the box. For those who wanted to try the subscription model, it was there. This was sensible. It let Adobe test the economics without burning the existing business. Then came May 2013. Adobe announced that it would no longer sell Creative Suite as perpetual software. New versions would be Creative Cloud only, subscription only. If you wanted the latest tools, you rented them, full stop. The reaction was immediate and not particularly polite. Adobe's share price dropped 12% in a single day. Over 50,000 people signed a petition demanding the company reverse the decision. Forums and design communities were alight with the kind of fury that usually accompanies a beloved institution doing something its users consider a fundamental betrayal. The complaints were legitimate, taken on their own terms. Professional designers who owned their licenses outright now faced a recurring cost that would, over several years, exceed the price of the software they had already paid for. Freelancers working in countries with currency exchange disadvantages felt it acutely. Small studios on tight margins felt it too. If you are finding this useful, and let's be honest, you probably downloaded Photoshop for free at least once in your life, do consider subscribing. It helps more than you would think, and we promise we will not put it behind a paywall. But here's where the story gets structurally interesting. Because buried inside the fury was a misunderstanding about what Adobe was actually optimizing for, and it wasn't primarily squeezing more money from existing professional users. Part 5. Why the numbers made the decision. Let's talk about what Adobe's leadership actually saw when they looked at the economics of the subscription model. Because this is where the structural logic becomes undeniable. Under the perpetual license model, Adobe's revenue was event-driven. A new Creative Suite release would generate a spike, then the line would flatten. Investors don't love flat lines, analysts don't love unpredictability, and Adobe's own ability to plan research and development investment was hampered by the uncertainty of whether the next version would sell as well as the last. Subscription revenue is the opposite. It is smooth, it is predictable, and critically, it compounds. Each new subscriber adds to an annualized revenue baseline that does not vanish the moment a product cycle ends. In financial terms, the shift from perpetual to subscription is a shift from transactional revenue to annual recurring revenue, ARR. And ARR is what modern technology investors price at a premium. The numbers bear this out comprehensively. Before the pivot, Adobe's total revenue stood at around £4.2 billion in 2011. By 2024, that figure had tripled to £21.5 billion. Subscriptions now represent 94% of total revenue. Annual recurring revenue reached £17.6 billion by 2025. The market cap, which dropped 12% on the day of the announcement, eventually grew from £16 billion before the transition to over £200 billion. That is not a rounding error, that is one of the most successful business model transformations in the history of the software industry. But the transition also solved a problem Adobe's finance team had been quietly wrestling with for years. When you sell a perpetual license, there is no mechanism to verify whether the software is being used by one person or 20. There is no cloud authentication. There is no ongoing relationship with the customer. There is just a disk, a key, and silence. Subscription software requires a login. It requires an active account. That one requirement quietly solved the piracy problem in a way that no amount of DRM ever had. If you do not have an active subscription, the software simply does not work. You cannot torrent ongoing authentication. And at £52.99 per month compared to over £1,000 up front, the economic incentive to pirate was substantially reduced. Adobe CEO Shantanu Narayan put it plainly when Creative Cloud passed 1 million subscribers in the third quarter of 2013, ahead of schedule. The transition, he said, was happening faster than expected. What he was seeing was not just adoption, he was seeing the conversion of an enormous latent user base, people who had been using Adobe products for free, into revenue-generating customers. Part 6. The timing question, or what Canva saw that Adobe couldn't afford to ignore. Here is the part of this story that tends to get underplayed. Adobe did not make this decision in a vacuum. It made this decision while watching the market beginning to shift beneath it. Canva launched in 2013, the same year Adobe announced the end of box software. Figma was founded in 2012. These were not just new tools, they were new business models. Browser-based, low-barrier, subscription-native from day one. Canva's free tier let anyone design anything without spending a penny. Figma's real-time collaboration rewrote what a design tool could even be. Adobe's boxed model, if left unchanged, was heading into direct conflict with this new generation. It was not because the tools were inferior. Adobe's technology remained industry-leading, but the pricing structure created a ceiling. Students could not afford it, emerging markets could not justify it. Hobbyists and small creators had no reason to pay 4 figures for software they would use twice a month. Subscription pricing paradoxically lowered the barrier to entry without lowering the product. It turned Adobe from an aspirational, occasional purchase into an accessible monthly expense, the same way Netflix turned film viewing from a cinema trip into a Tuesday evening habit. Speaking of monthly subscriptions you keep forgetting to cancel, if this channel has been worth a like, that button is right there. Unlike Adobe, we are not forcing your hand. Yet. The point is that Adobe's 2013 decision was not purely offensive. There was a defensive dimension too. The perpetual license model was sustainable against similarly priced, similarly structured competitors. It was not sustainable against a new class of tools designed to price it out of the mass market. The subscription model was, in part, Adobe's answer to the question, how do we own the bottom of the market before someone else does? Part 7. Kill your own business before the market does. There is a concept in business strategy sometimes called disruptive self-cannibalization. The idea is simple, even if the execution almost never is. The greatest threat to a dominant business model is not a competitor, it is the next version of itself. Adobe's situation in 2011 and 2012 was precisely this. The perpetual license model was profitable, familiar, and defensible in the short term. But the incentive architecture underneath it was misaligned with where the market was going. Revenue was lumpy, customer relationships were transactional, piracy was endemic, and a new generation of subscription-native competitors was being funded and built. The company had a choice. It could optimize the existing model, squeeze a few more upgrade cycles, tighten anti-piracy measures, resist the pressure to change, or it could disrupt itself, absorb the short-term pain, the stock drop, the petition, the customer fury, in exchange for a fundamentally stronger long-term position. The reason this is difficult is not technical, it is political. Disrupting your own model means arguing inside the organization that the thing that made you successful is now a liability. It means accepting that your best customers will be angry with you. It means watching your share price fall on the day of the announcement and trusting that the underlying logic will eventually be legible to the market. Adobe stock dropped 12% in May 2013. By 2020, it had risen over 1,300% from its 2012 baseline. The market cap went from £16 billion to north of £200 billion. Those 50,000 petition signatures are a historical footnote. The annual recurring revenue is the actual story. What Adobe understood, and what many companies in similar positions fail to act on, is that the right time to kill your business model is before you have to. Not when competitors are already eating your market share, not when the quarterly numbers start declining, but while you are still strong enough to absorb the disruption on your own terms, control the narrative, and invest in what comes next. The version of Adobe that stayed with perpetual licenses would have faced Canva, Figma, and a dozen subscription-native competitors from an increasingly weak position. The version that blew up its own model first now generates more in annual recurring revenue than its entire business was worth the decade before. There is a version of this story where Adobe is the villain, a corporation capturing its user base in a subscription trap and extracting rent indefinitely. That framing is not entirely wrong. The frustrations are real, the power asymmetry is real. But the structural reading is more interesting and arguably more useful. Adobe did not change its pricing because it was greedy. It changed its pricing because the architecture of its original model, designed for a world of physical disks, irregular upgrade cycles, and a customer base that could afford 4-figure software, was becoming incompatible with the world it was operating in. The subscription model aligned Adobe's incentives with its customers' usage. It converted piracy into revenue. It smoothed the financial profile that investors price at a premium, and it positioned the company to compete in a market where the alternative was being outflanked by tools that were free. Sometimes killing your business model is not destruction. Sometimes it is the most precise form of construction there is. If you want to understand what happens when a company does not make this call in time, stay close. The story is coming. Subscribe if you want more of this. We cover how power systems are built, how they scale, and why they break. No hype, no drama, just the mechanics.